New York, 1956. The city was bleeding money and ambition. Beneath the glow of neon bars and the rumble of subways, deals were struck in whispers and gunfire. It was the year when organized crime ruled the boroughs like an invisible government, and Elias Crowe was one of its most unpredictable sons. Elias was not born into power. He earned it in alleys. He had started as a debt collector for the Romano syndicate, a quiet-spoken kid with a talent for turning hesitation into fear. He never smiled, never shouted. That made men listen. By 27, he had moved from Harlem backrooms to Midtown's polished clubs, running the syndicate's gambling take and protecting its ledgers from city inspectors who already owed him favors. The police knew his name. The newspapers did not yet. That changed on the night of February 2, 1956, when Clara Devine, a college student from Queens, was found dead in a tenement stairwell near East 74th Street. The killing was brutal, deliberate. The only fingerprints on the railing matched Elias Crowe's. Detective Henry Lowenstein, a veteran with 20 years of dirt under his nails, called it the kind of case that burns a hole through the city. Within hours, squad cars raided the Romano warehouse near the docks. Elias was not there. He had been tipped off by someone inside the department, they said, but 2 days later, he walked into the precinct himself, hands in his pockets, jacket pressed, and asked, "You boys looking for me?" What happened next would immortalize him. As the police van rolled down 12th Avenue that gray March morning, a crowd had already gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted his name. Women in hats craned to see the college girl killer. Inside the van, Elias sat in silence until the doors creaked open. A flashbulb went off, and something inside him cracked. He lunged toward the light, shouting, "You don't know what you're looking at." The photograph that followed froze him forever, a man mid-scream, eyes wide, wrists bound in steel. The front page of the New York Herald the next day read, "Crowe, the face of evil." But to those who had known him in the underworld, the image meant something else. It was not guilt, it was betrayal. Everyone could see it in his eyes. Someone had set him up, and the photo made sure there'd be no coming back. Detective Lowenstein did not believe in coincidences. The file on Clara Devine was too clean, the evidence too neat. A week before her death, she had been working part-time at Brookhaven Psychiatric Institute, a hospital on Long Island with quiet federal ties. Crowe had been a patient there once, years earlier, after a temporary nervous breakdown, according to sealed records. Nobody was supposed to know that. Meanwhile, inside the Romano syndicate, fear spread faster than newsprint. Elias had been keeping the books for Anthony Romano himself, and those ledgers, now missing, detailed cash flow to politicians, precinct captains, even a deputy commissioner. If Elias talked, the whole network could crumble. 3 nights after the arrest, Romano met with 2 of his lieutenants at a diner near Battery Park. They ate in silence until Romano finally said, "That picture killed him already. Let the papers bury the rest." The order was simple: make sure Crowe never reaches trial. But the city had changed since Prohibition. The mob no longer owned every cop. Some wanted justice, others wanted headlines. Crowe survived 2 suicides in custody, one by hanging, another by poison, slipped into his coffee, and when the second failed, Lowenstein quietly moved him to an isolated cell under guard. Outside, the photograph spread across the country. It appeared in Life, The Times, even foreign papers. To the public, it was proof that New York was finally fighting back against its devils. To those who lived in its shadows, it was a warning. Anyone can be framed if the picture's good enough. By the end of that spring, Elias Crowe's name had become legend, half killer, half martyr. The truth was murkier, buried beneath witnesses who vanished, files that burned, and money that changed hands faster than bullets. What began as a murder case had turned into something larger, a collision between power, image, and fear. The city's underworld had thrived on secrecy for decades. Now, one photograph had dragged it, screaming, into the light. And Elias Crowe, the man in the frame, was no longer just another soldier. He was the story itself, and everyone from the commissioner's office to the Romano family was about to learn that once a picture escapes into history, it cannot be silenced. Elias Crowe's story did not start with blood. It started with poverty, the kind that shapes loyalty like iron under heat. Born in 1929 on the Lower East Side, Elias was the second of 3 brothers. His father worked the docks, his mother took in laundry. The Depression took both. By 14, he was running packages for the corner bookmaker. By 16, he was carrying a revolver with the serial number scratched off. The city during the 1940s was a map of power lines drawn in shadow. Every block belonged to someone. Every bar had an owner whose name never appeared on the license. For a kid like Elias, survival meant picking the right men to fear. His first arrest came at 17, assault and grand theft auto. But the case disappeared after one night in the precinct. That was when Anthony Romano first heard his name. Romano was old-school Sicilian, disciplined and ruthless. He ran numbers, protection, and liquor routes stretching from the Bronx to Staten Island. He did not trust many, but he saw something in Crowe. "He's quiet," Romano told his underboss. "Quiet men think before they shoot." From that night, Elias was under his wing. For nearly a decade, Crowe learned how the machine worked. He handled collections, bribed inspectors, and oversaw gambling dens that looked like jazz clubs from the outside. He never touched drugs, Romano forbade it, but he knew who did, and where their shipments landed. He also knew every man who got paid to look the other way. By 1953, Elias had become more than muscle. He was an accountant in the underworld's truest sense. His ledgers, written in careful cursive, contained secrets worth more than gold payments to city officials, bank transfers through shell companies, even coded notes on shipments labeled furniture. That was the year Romano trusted him with something new: Brookhaven Psychiatric Institute. On paper, Brookhaven was a hospital for veterans and trauma patients. In reality, it was a laundering front. Syndicate money flowed through medical research grants and property transfers. Patients were admitted, bills inflated, and funds washed clean through federal subsidies. Elias managed the paperwork, but the deeper he looked, the stranger it got. There were rooms not listed on blueprints, doctors paid in cash, and names that never appeared twice. When Clara Devine took a part-time clerical job there in early 1956, she unknowingly stepped into a storm. Records later revealed she had access to Brookhaven's payroll system and discovered a series of payments under Elias's authorization tied to accounts in Cuba and the Bahamas. Days before her death, she had written a letter to the state auditor. It was never mailed. Detective Lowenstein found fragments of it during the investigation. He also found something else, a sealed envelope marked BHI, Crowe. Inside were copies of 2 receipts showing wire transfers totaling over $200,000, both signed in Elias's hand. To the press, it was motive. To Lowenstein, it was proof that someone wanted those receipts gone forever. In his cell, Elias spoke little. He asked for newspapers, a cigarette, and silence. When Lowenstein questioned him about Brookhaven, he simply said, "That place makes men disappear." Then he added, almost under his breath, "And not just the living." The detective could not tell if it was paranoia or a warning. Outside, the Romano syndicate was tearing itself apart. Federal attention was tightening around their businesses, and Crowe's arrest had drawn cameras they could not afford. Romano began erasing his own tracks, burning records, closing fronts, silencing anyone who could tie him to Brookhaven. But it was too late. Elias had hidden copies of everything. Where? No one knew. Some said he mailed them to a lawyer upstate. Others whispered he had buried them under the docks. Whatever the truth, Romano's men started dying. One was shot in his car. Another vanished from a ferry. The message was clear: someone was cleaning house. By May 1956, the city had turned cold. Reporters wanted a confession. Politicians wanted closure. The mob wanted silence. And Elias Crowe, sitting in his dim cell beneath Manhattan Criminal Court, had become the most dangerous man alive, not because of what he had done, but because of what he knew. Detective Lowenstein began to see the pattern. Every time the investigation reached toward Brookhaven, evidence disappeared. Files misplaced. Witnesses recanted. One morning, Lowenstein found his own desk drawer, forced open, his notes gone. When he told the commissioner, he got a tight smile and a single word: careful. That night, Lowenstein drove to Rikers Island alone. The guard on duty said Crowe had not spoken all day. But when the detective approached the cell, Elias looked up, eyes calm, and said, "You think I killed her?" Lowenstein did not answer. Elias smiled faintly. "Then you don't know this city at all." Outside, rain pounded the harbor. Inside, a man who might have been a murderer or a scapegoat leaned back in the half-light, while the empire that built him began to devour itself from within. The weeks that followed Clara Devine's death were a study in controlled chaos. Newspapers ran stories with increasingly sensational headlines, and City Hall was ablaze with whispers of corruption reaching the highest offices. Yet Elias Crowe remained a ghost in the storm, quiet, measured, and most dangerously, untouchable. Inside Rikers, rumors about him circulated like smoke. Other inmates whispered that Crowe had connections reaching beyond the city, men in Washington, financiers in Havana, even a few officers on the NYPD payroll. No one dared approach him with threats or favors. He existed outside the normal currency of prison life. Guards noted his strange calm, the way he walked unhurried to meals, the way he read old newspapers and memorized dates and names. He was building a mental ledger far larger than any physical one could contain. Romano, meanwhile, was unraveling. The syndicate's usual discretion was gone, replaced by frantic phone calls, burned documents, and disappearing lieutenants. One evening, in a private Manhattan loft, Romano spoke to his consigliere, a man named Giancarlo Vitale. "The boy knows more than he should," Romano said, pacing. "And that photograph, it made him immortal. We can't touch him the way we used to. Not publicly. Not now." Vitale nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Crowe's enemies were trapped between action and exposure. Any attempt to eliminate him could trigger a cascade, revealing years of embezzlement and murder. Crowe, of course, knew it. He had seen the body of a mid-level enforcer float in the East River, eyes wide and mouth frozen in surprise. He had read the obituaries of men who vanished overnight. Each event confirmed a singular principle he had learned in his teenage years. Knowledge was power, silence was armor, and fear could be weaponized. Detective Lowenstein, frustrated by the vanishing trail of evidence, began following a new line of inquiry. He traced payments from Brookhaven, not just to the Bahamas, but to offshore trusts linked to politicians whose names appeared in Romano's ledgers. For the first time, he sensed that Crowe was not merely a suspect. He was a gatekeeper to a network so vast, it threatened to destabilize the city itself. Lowenstein attempted to extract information during a series of interrogations, but Crowe offered only fragments, cryptic observations, half-truths, and riddles masked as answers. "The city does not forgive," Crowe remarked one morning, gazing out the barred window at the Manhattan skyline. "It remembers every debt, every favor, every betrayal. You think a photograph ends a story? It only begins it." Lowenstein scribbled furiously, sensing a confession hiding behind the man's calm veneer, yet never materializing. Outside, the public obsession with the photograph intensified. Crowds at newsstands demanded copies of the Herald. Columnists debated whether Crowe was a monster or a victim. For the underworld, however, it was a warning. Trust was a commodity, and betrayal had become a weapon. Every hitman, bookie, and fixer recalculated their loyalties, wondering who might be next. By mid-June, a subtle shift had occurred. Romano's empire, once a fortress of certainty, was now a precarious web of fear. Men who once reported to him now took instructions from whispers of Crowe's strategy. Those who remained loyal did so out of calculation, not devotion. And all the while, the photograph that had captured Elias's scream circulated silently, a visual ledger of power and peril. One night, Lowenstein received an anonymous tip. A small warehouse on Cherry Street contained boxes of documents and ledgers, files too precise to have survived accidental oversight. The note read simply, "Look for the man who screams in the light. He leaves nothing behind." The detective understood immediately it was Crowe's signature, a breadcrumb trail through the city's dark arteries. As he prepared to investigate, Crowe remained in his cell reading the morning paper, smoking, and calculating. Every alliance, every enemy, every photograph taken, every ledger signed, all part of a game the city did not yet comprehend. The man once suspected of murder had become something else entirely, the architect of shadows, a living ledger of New York's sins, and the keeper of a secret so devastating that its exposure could unravel not just the syndicate, but the city itself. And in the quiet corners of Rikers, amidst the clatter of keys and distant shouts, Elias Crowe smiled faintly. The game had only just begun. July 1956 arrived with relentless heat and a tension that seemed to drip from the streets of Manhattan. Crowe's photograph had become a permanent stain on the city's consciousness, and with every passing day, the whispers of his influence grew louder than the sirens. The detectives, reporters, and mobsters who once thought they controlled the narrative now felt like chess pieces in his invisible game. Detective Lowenstein began to understand the scope of Crowe's network. It was no longer a matter of the Romano syndicate alone. Crowe's influence reached precinct captains, city clerks, and even judges who had turned a blind eye for years. Every attempt to press him for a confession only revealed more of his calculating mind. When asked about Brookhaven and the missing ledgers, Crowe leaned back in his cell and said, "Some men live in the light of law, others in the shadow of secrets. I live in the ledger." Meanwhile, Romano's empire was collapsing like sand through a sieve. The men he had trusted for decades were dying, disappearing, or betraying each other. One lieutenant, Silvio Mancini, was found hanged in a Harlem tenement. A note in his pocket read simply, "Errors are expensive." Another, Marco Lanza, vanished from a ferry ride to Staten Island, his absence leaving only ripples across the water. Rumors spread that Crowe had orchestrated each event with meticulous precision. The city itself began to shift. Banks tightened surveillance. Newspapers demanded verification from every source. And City Hall initiated quiet audits of departments that had long been exempt from scrutiny. Crowe's knowledge was no longer just dangerous, it was contagious. Men who had once laughed at threats now checked over their shoulders. Power had become a fragile illusion, and the architect of its collapse sat behind steel bars, unreadable and calm. In his cell, Crowe began documenting everything in secret. Pages of a ledger, coded in a cipher only he understood. Detailed transactions, bribes, threats, and disappearances. The entries were precise, almost obsessive, a map of corruption that could bring the entire city to its knees if revealed. Lowenstein caught glimpses of the pages during visits. Names crossed out, notes in margins, numerical sequences that defied ordinary understanding. Crowe's mind was a vault, and the key was only his. The tipping point came on July 21st. Lowenstein received another anonymous tip, a meeting at a warehouse on the west side, where Romano's remaining lieutenants would discuss their next move. Arriving early, the detective found crates of ledgers, money, and documents the skeleton of an empire. In the shadows, a figure watched silently, a man in a tailored suit, cigarette in hand, eyes cold. Crowe had left instructions for the police without ever leaving Rikers. He had turned the mob's own paranoia into a trap. Romano, frantic, called meetings across the city, but nothing stabilized. His once mighty network had become a haunted maze, and he realized that Crowe was no longer a subordinate, an accountant, or even a potential threat to be bargained with. He was a force of nature, a ledger in motion, a man who wielded knowledge as weaponry. Lowenstein, walking through the warehouse, could not shake the feeling that the city itself had changed. The alleys seemed narrower, the shadows deeper, and the sense of inevitability heavier. Crowe had made a statement: power in New York was no longer a matter of fear or bullets. It was information, and the man behind it had already won. Back in Rikers, Elias Crowe leaned against the cold wall, flipping the morning newspaper. Headlines screamed about the mob's unraveling, but he did not smile. The ledger was complete. The photograph was immortal. And New York, every street, every precinct, every office, was a city under his gaze. The game had escalated. Not just survival, not just reputation, but domination. And as the summer sun set over the East River, Crowe knew the final moves had yet to be made. In the ledger of blood and betrayal, he alone held the pen. August 1956 arrived like a silent predator. The city's heat had softened, but its fear had hardened. Across Manhattan, whispers of Elias Crowe's influence no longer carried uncertainty, they carried inevitability. The photograph that had once captured his scream now seemed prophetic, a frozen testament to a man who understood the machinery of power better than anyone else. Anthony Romano, once untouchable, now wandered through his remaining empire like a ghost, haunted by men who had vanished, documents that had disappeared, and the gnawing certainty that Crowe had already anticipated every move. Romano's attempts at retaliation, shootings, threats, bribes failed spectacularly. Men who had once obeyed orders now hesitated, waiting for invisible instructions. The syndicate's skeleton crew realized too late that they were operating in a labyrinth designed by Crowe himself. Detective Lowenstein, worn and sleepless, had begun piecing together the final sequence. The warehouse on Cherry Street had been the key. The ledgers, meticulously organized, revealed the flow of money, influence, and fear, but also the patterns of betrayal and survival. Lowenstein recognized the genius of Crowe's strategy. Every transaction, every disappearance, every secret, calculated to destabilize the syndicate without leaving a trace back to him. Crowe's reputation had become an unspoken law. Even in his silence, he dictated the city's movements. One morning, Lowenstein received a tip to meet him alone at a secluded pier on the Hudson. When he arrived, the detective found only a note. "The ledger balances itself. Check the docks, midnight." That night, under a waning moon, Lowenstein discovered crates of missing files evidence, cash, and records of every payment from the Romano Empire. A single envelope lay on top, addressed in Elias's precise hand. "Justice is an accounting problem. Solve it wisely." The message was clear. Crowe had orchestrated everything from within Rikers, leaving the city to untangle the chaos without ever revealing himself. Romano's final gambit, a desperate attempt to consolidate what remained of his network, ended in disaster. Meetings were ambushed, lieutenants betrayed each other, and the last safe houses were compromised. By the end of August, Romano had fled New York, his empire reduced to whispers and empty buildings. Men loyal to Crowe quietly stepped into positions of authority, not through violence, but through knowledge. The ledger had dictated the new hierarchy. Lowenstein, returning to the precinct, understood the final truth. Crowe was untouchable, not because he had avoided murder or crime, but because he had turned the city itself into his instrument. Power no longer resided in force. It resided in understanding, patience, and calculation. The man who once collected debts in Harlem alleys had become the unseen governor of New York's shadows. Back in Rikers, Elias Crowe read the Herald once more. Headlines screamed of mob collapses, political investigations, and unsolved murders. Outside, the city was unaware of the invisible hand guiding its fate. Crowe folded the paper, leaned back, and whispered to himself, "Every ledger balances eventually. Some just take longer." The photograph remained pinned above his bunk, the frozen scream now a symbol of strategy perfected. Every man who had doubted him, feared him, or sought to control him had been accounted for. New York had survived its summer of terror, but it had done so under Crowe's terms. In that half-light cell, the architect of shadows, the keeper of ledgers, and the man who had rewritten the rules of power smiled faintly. The city's story had changed, and so had its understanding of fear, influence, and precision. Elias Crowe had not just survived. He had orchestrated a masterclass in control, a game in which the price of every action was measured and the cost of a mistake could be death. And in the ledger of Manhattan, every entry now bore his signature.